Welcome, everyone, to our fourth and final webinar in our series, Minimizing Impact of Research and Logistics in the Polar Regions. This is a collaboration between the European Polar Board and APECS, the Association of for Polar Early Career Scientists. Yes, welcome back for everyone who's been to our other webinars, and hello to all newcomers. My name is Marije Tempel from the EPB Secretariat. And before introducing our speakers, I always start with highlighting the synthesis report that you can see here as well. This report, drafted by the EPB's Action Group on Environmental Impacts of Polar Research and Logistics, covers many best practices and a catalog of existing guidelines. I'm a really big fan of this synthesis report. That's why I always highlight it again and again. And you can access the report via the link in the chat box and also on our website. I will also share some other interesting publications regarding this topic at the end of the webinar for you to look into. So this webinar series was initiated as a follow-up to this report, and each webinar features a 40-minute lecture followed by a Q&A session. And like always, we encourage your participation through the Q&A box. So if you have any questions, you can share them there. If you have questions during the presentation, please share your questions also in the Q&A box. And after the lecture, I will moderate the Q&A and share all your questions with our speakers of today. Please note that we record all webinars for later sharing on our EPB YouTube channel. So you can already find the previous webinars there. Please take a look if you're interested. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers of today, Svenja Holste and Amy Macfarlane. Amy worked as a snow scientist on the Mosaic expedition during her PhD. More about this later. And now she's focusing on promoting transparent fieldwork and environmental impact assessments in Arctic science. She coordinates the RISE APECS project group to facilitate concrete actions and discussions on reducing the environmental impact of research. Currently, Amy is a postdoc at the University of Tromsø and the Northumbria University in the UK, continuing her research on snow on Arctic sea ice. And then as a second speaker today, we also have Svenja. She is a PhD student at Bielefeld University in Germany, where she investigates research practices in the Arctic from a sociology of science and critical geopolitics perspective. As part of a collaboration between APECS and the Horizon 2020 project Interact, Svenja began looking into ways to reduce the carbon footprint of professional travel. She's also part of RISE, the project group of APECS, and describes it as a very encouraging and powerful network to her. So I'm really curious to hear more about that. I'm very pleased to have them here today to share their activities at RISE and to reflect on the series and the topics that we've discussed in the previous webinars as we look ahead to responsible fieldwork. So a warm welcome to Svenja and Amy, and let's start this webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll kick off this webinar just by saying thank you, Marije, for the introductions, and thank you to EPB, European Polar Board, for this opportunity to present. 40 minutes is a long time to present, so I hope we keep you engaged for that amount of time, and we throw a question out quite early on, so we hope that we can have a quite interactive discussion at the end with those joining online. So just to start, so we chose the title of this talk to be Bottom-up Initiatives for Responsible Fieldwork. And one of the questions that we often think about and get asked is, why do we use this word responsible? So quite often sustainable is used interchangeably with responsible, but we actually chose this deliberately because sustainability really implies that we have the ability to conduct these scientific activities for a long time into the future. The actual definition is to be able to be maintained at a certain rate or level. And we actually want to kind of spin this on its head a little bit and think, while and take the idea of being responsible, which is more to implying about taking responsibility for constantly minimizing our negative environmental impact, which is regardless of the system. So it's not dependent on how the system is going to handle our actions. And it really takes this idea that responsible scientific practices mean that we take all possible steps to reduce the impact of our activities. And we feel like it's a bit more applicable. So yeah, diving into the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy, and also welcome from my side, and thanks for having me as well. We were thinking when preparing the presentation that we would like to share with you a short recap of the previous webinars and share with you what we have learned so far from the great presentations we already had in the previous weeks. So in the first webinar, it was all about non-native species in Antarctica, and amongst other very important things, I think we learned three important steps to meet challenges of non-native species in Antarctica. And the first thing is that prevention is key. The second step is that we really need monitoring mechanisms. And the third one is that we need to think about successful responses to meet these challenges. For instance, eradication or control. And one key word in this presentation was biosecurity. And one quote that resonates with me that I would like to share here is that biosecurity takes time, it takes investment, it never ends, and it will not get you any thanks, but it is the best that we can do. And I think this was one of the key messages that that we took away from the first webinar.
Yeah, so then moving on to the second webinar, which was about conservation of lakes and ecosystems, which was extremely interesting by Antonio. And I think the takeaway that I specifically got from this is that we have this inevitable impact when we go to the field. When you enter these remote locations, especially if they've not been entered previously, or if you first want to do the scientific research there, or even if it's a long-term monitoring area, you always have this impact. And the point is that we don't know what the impact is exactly until we've made the impact. And the fact is that we really need to measure this. So being able to document our impact only occurs when we've been in this location. We can assess it beforehand, but really to find out what has happened, it's kind of a double-edged sword, which is quite a challenge to deal with. So just summarizing that it's basically in our best interest to reduce the impact before we enter these environments. And then we can start to think about improving the measurement quality to document our impact so that we can reduce it in the future. And I really like the idea that, or the action that Antonio had, that within his project group, he actually asks each individual going into the field to conduct their own impact assessment, before going into the field. So this is really a perfect example of a bottom-up approach, which we'll talk a little bit about later.
Yes, and then in the third webinar, we heard from Birgit about the Antarctic Treaty System that was established to ensure peace, to enable science, and to protect Antarctica. And we learned especially about the Madrid Protocol for environmental protection and how top-down policies are set up to ensure environmental protection. And it became clear that there are many different frameworks for environmental regulation, so global agreements specifically or especially to govern international waters. Then we have this complex treaty system. But we also learned that it is different compared to the Arctic, where fieldwork is often under national jurisdiction, and regulations that are successful in Antarctica might be not relevant or can be not applied to the Arctic. So, in addition, in the Arctic, we have a special case that research activities not only have an environmental impact, but also are impacting Arctic communities. And this is not topic of this webinar here, and it could be a whole new webinar series, but yeah, just to mention it. And then we have 3 cross-cutting topics and overall takeaways from the whole series so far. So we think that, first of all the webinars argue for the precautionary principle and the importance to preserve the systems we have. Second, the presentations all demonstrated that we really need to advance knowledge. And third, it becomes clear that this is all happening on a very complex and big scale. Especially when it comes to policy, there's a lot of patience and sometimes baby steps needed. Many nations and many different actors are involved, so this can slow down processes. And also we have external pressure in form of climate change, which makes it really urgent to take action.
Yeah, so then kind of moving on to our own seminar, and what we can bring to kind of summarize all of these amazing, individual ideas. So we really thought that this top-down approach can work for Antarctica and some regions in the Arctic, for example, terrestrial regions. And in these areas where you have this top-down approach, those doing the fieldwork know the steps that they can take to reduce the environmental impact. There's obviously sometimes guidelines that they can access, and it's made very clear about the protocols to follow. But for example, there's this issue where for example, an early career researcher or a non-early career researcher, if they don't have access to any guidelines, for example, in the Arctic, in Central Arctic is a good example of this. We really need to think about how we can improve the current setup so that we can guide and advise if they see something, for example, that isn't necessarily to the high standard that they would expect. Who do you talk to, or which document do you follow? So this bottom-up approach is really applicable to general fieldwork. It's really applicable to all individuals going into the field, and all individuals, yes, need to think about their actions. But it's really more applicable in areas where there are fewer top-down guidelines in place. For example, yeah, I said before, like the Central Arctic, but also general remote areas where also there's no indigenous communities, so there are fewer guidelines, for example. Yeah.
And then when we think about bottom-up initiatives and the relevance of bottom-up initiatives, we can also think about the role of early career researchers in this. And there are many, many reasons why early career researchers are important in this discussion. And 2 of them are here. So early career researchers are often at the forefront of fieldwork, and this makes them well positioned to advocate for and to implement sustainable practices. And also, we as early career researchers are the next generation of scientists. So we have a vested interest in ensuring that research practices evolve in a way that meets the challenges of climate change and environmental sustainability. And yeah, I think there are many different levels where we could have impact.
Yeah, so thinking about from a bottom-up approach, it's very easy to get, in my opinion, quite swamped by the scale of everything. So like as an individual, what impact and what influence can you have on this huge system that's very efficient at running itself? So I think here we can really try and shift our idea that the end goal doesn't have to be so far away. So when individuals, it depends on where you are in your career stage or project, but it's very often that individuals can have an impact to those close around, and even going up to institutes and research station level. We feel like it's a lot less likely that individuals could have an impact on national and international level, but there could be this knock-on effect. So it's not we like grade out this national international mountain, but it's still there, to have a possible impact. So at each level, so individuals can really make choices on how they travel to fieldwork or how they are getting involved in the planning stage of a project, and really reflecting on their own role in each of these roles. So making sure that like you're aware of the guidelines in place if there are any, and really starting this network with people around you to bring these discussions together, and think about these topics and maybe like bridging them out to a larger audience. And then thinking that, when you are having these discussions with communities, that everyone's perspective and everyone's experience is very different. So having these open discussions, which are non-judgmental because people have come from different backgrounds, I think is extremely important on this topic in particular. And then, moving up to research groups and projects, we gain a bit of traction, but then research groups can really set up trainings and workshops like this one to facilitate knowledge transfer. Maybe setting up easy to access impact assessments, so that scientists have the opportunity to reduce their impact with this kind of guidelines in place. And yeah, again, it comes back to this, but creating space to have these open discussions, and supporting each individual at different levels of their career. And then the third pillar, institutes and research stations. This is really kind of the end goal to the bottom-up approach, but sharing best practices and developing these guidelines and setting up institutional policies, that's also a very important thing to be considering. So for example, the Green Lab initiative or specific travel policies for that institute. And then, yeah, national and international level goes into permits and regulations or collaborating globally. But we feel this is maybe a bit of a too big a stretch for individuals at this level. But we have a little bit of work calling on funding agencies, and we're seeing more and more involvement in funding agencies to ask for environmental impact considerations when applying. At least, I'm speaking about kind of an Arctic approach when I'm discussing this, but yes, those are the steps.
And now, if we turn from the general steps and levels of influence to you as our audience today, we would like to shortly interrupt our presentation, but propose a question to you that we would like to discuss later in the Q&A. So the question is, how do you see yourself or your institute in a 5 to 10 year time frame working to reduce the impact of scientific activities, and what framework could be set up to help make this happen? And why we ask this, or maybe just to give you some examples or inspiration, how one could think about this is that we would be interested in your thoughts of how you imagine your scientific future. So will you have an instrument that is more environmentally friendly, and does your institute then have better guidelines to help facilitate these developments? Or can you see yourself changing the way you travel to the field? And will there be maybe travel policies or in place, or funding targeted at this? And also, will it be maybe clearer for you who to go to and talk to if you would like to reduce impact of fieldwork, and how can those discussions be opened up to include early career researchers? So we are very much looking forward to your thoughts and responses, and it would be great if you could, while we continue with our presentation, if you could just put them in the chat or save them for the later discussion.
Yeah, so we really jumped into it then. So I'm just going to take a little step back and say, you know, who we are, where we're coming from, and what is actually in place at the moment for these bottom-up discussions. So here's a little introduction. I'm just going to give a little introduction to APECS, so the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, which is really for polar and alpine researchers, but also general, the wider cryosphere research. And it's for early career researchers to join this organization and have discussions. One example is they have like national groups, so have discussions within your community in the country that you're working in. But it also branches out into a project groups, which is where the Responsible Science Initiative, named RISE, is located. So we are a permanent project group, so we last for 1 year. It's like a rolling term. And we started, we're just going into our 3rd year. So we are we're getting quite a lot of traction and a lot of exciting opportunities like the one here. And it's really this environment for early career researchers to get together. We particularly have the setup of a monthly online discussion and we also have an email list where we share interesting news and documents that have come out recently to the group. So it's a nice area to kind of group together these discussions to talk about sustainability and responsibility within scientific research. And so I'll just talk about the 6 objectives that the group has. We decided these quite early on, split them up to these 6 that you can see on the screen. So the first one is I'll go clockwise, but starting at research and development, we agreed that there was a great need for more environmentally friendly tools and equipment to be used in the field. And this is getting, there's a lot of funding currently out there, depending on the country that you're in, to develop instrumentation, and also having this push to improve the sustainability of it. So this kind of fell into this research and development. So, the conversation started as someone thinking of, there were the atmospheric balloons that get released to measure the vertical profiles of atmospheric conditions. That what materials can be used so these could degrade. Like this is a typical example of that. But also, moving around to promoting exemplary projects and recent publications. We have, as I said, like the email list where we collect these kind of knowledge base, because it's quite easy to get overwhelmed with all of these documentations that are out there. So really working on creating these like kind of a go-to database for interesting documents. And influencing Arctic politics, that's policies, specifically in the Arctic because there's maybe a bit more room for bottom-up changes. So that's why we focused on the Arctic here. But releasing opinion articles and increasing collaborations with scientists to try and influence this. I'll go through the others a bit quicker, but because we've got a few more slides to go. But yeah, we've document and quantify the impacts, which we'll talk a bit more about later, conducting impact assessments, hosting workshops and presenting at conferences. We're quite active in this, and we'll talk about what we've done already. And then increase scientific community involvement, which, is exactly what we're doing right now. Yeah, so hosting workshops, presenting at conferences. We've had a few in the past years that we've co-hosted with European Polar Board or SCAR or I've missed someone here, but yeah, we've having a lot of collaborations. And for example, we've had a workshop which was minimizing the environmental impact of polar research by different modes of access. So this was really looking into remote and virtual access into polar regions, where we had a nice presentation and discussion. And then also at the APECS conference, which is top right in 2023, we had a panelist discussion. So we invited 5 panelists to join and present their experience in responsible scientific activities. And we had a really great discussion for that, which I believe is posted online. So that's also if you're interested to go and listen to this discussion.
We also like really to collaborate with other institutions. So we also in 2023, but earlier we had a workshop at the Arctic Science Summit Week in collaboration with EPB and ISC and APECS, where we were sharing basically best practices of reducing the environmental impact at individual, institutional, conference and at fieldwork level. As Amy just said, one of our objectives is also to influence Arctic policies, and we would like to highlight two examples here. So one is an Interact report on reducing CO2 emissions in Arctic science, and this was also an APECS project group from 2021 to 2022 with 10 early career researchers who were very eager on working and developing guidelines how to reduce travel-related emissions. And this report was published to really raise awareness and give handy guidelines for people who are interested in this.
Yes, and we also created an opinion piece, which was really calling for funding bodies to help reduce the environmental impacts of remote scientific fieldwork, which is very relevant to this webinar series. And the main takeaways that we were talking about in there was really requiring early environmental impact assessments when projects are applying for grant proposals, and really considering how they are mitigating, the measures that they're taking to mitigate these environmental impacts. The second would be that we said was really to give researchers the means to finance these measures, so putting more weight on the ability to reduce the impact, and then finally following up on the status of this project. So really saying, lessons learned, how can we learn from these impact assessments in the future, and having kind of a standardized protocol or a more standardized protocol for these assessments so we can really compare between different fieldworks. And finally, not finally, I think we've got one more, but documenting and quantifying the impacts whilst creating guidelines. We've got a few things underway within the group. So we've got environmental impact acknowledgement guidelines, which is really if, for example, someone has gone into the field and in their presentation or on a website, on the project website or on the article that they're about to publish, acknowledging that their fieldwork has had an impact is step one. And then so we're working to create these guidelines on how to acknowledge and an easy thing that easy sentences that could apply to many different projects. And finally, working on the Mosaic Expedition Environmental Impact Assessment, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But in this slide, I think I'll just say that we were heavily using the European Polar Board synthesis report throughout this impact assessment. So it's just highlighting the importance of these guidelines and how useful they could be in projects moving forward.
Yes, and as Amy already said, RISE project group is a permanent group in APECS, and we, of course, want to increase engagement within the scientific community. So we now begin our third term with 20 members. And I believe that Amy will also talk about how to get involved at a later stage of this presentation. So after hearing all these, many different solutions and outputs and things people are engaged in within RISE as a network, really, we wanted to also use this opportunity to share our more personal experiences. And I will start, and then Amy will follow with telling some of our experiences in this discussions. So when I started to get involved in APECS and Interact, I was really interested to explore options and solutions how to reduce the environmental impact of travel-related activities, because this was something that I was thinking about in my private life already. And also it seemed quite easy in the beginning because I started during the COVID-19 pandemic. So everybody more or less stayed at home anyways. And online meetings was the new way to go. So in this APECS Interact collaboration, together with many others, early career researchers, we exchanged a lot about challenges and solutions. And for instance, we differentiated between day-to-day travel and conference travel and fieldwork travel. And we came up with a number of solutions. There are so many, like remote or virtual access, or changing of field practices, or more data sharing, or as you can see in the picture, choosing night trains instead of flights, if possible. And those solutions all come with advantages and disadvantages, of course. So most of the time, still, it is more costly, more time intensive, and it requires more planning efforts to travel with lower emissions. But what really was important and a takeaway for me during this journey was that even though my individual footprint might seem very small, it is the one activity over which I have control. And so if all the individual action was cumulated, it might turn out to have a rather significant impact. And so I really wanted then to question, how could changing my actions make a difference? And then it is a bit self-reflection work. So how do I live in my private life? How do I want my professional life to look like? Where do I see my responsibility? Where do I see my options? Also, where do I see my limits? And very important for early career researchers, where do I, what do I need to pursue a successful career in science? And I think it is important to note here that it's very dependent on the research fields, and this might be on different scales, and this might address very different scopes of action. So a remote field campaign in the natural science, of course, has different conditions than my political science project. But still, I think everyone can make some impact. What I also experienced, and this is the last thing I would like to share, is that these discussions can be challenging at some point, especially when you meet people who have different standpoints or when you're being confronted with different perspectives on this topic. And I also think that sometimes this can turn into emotional debates, which is clear because it's very personal journeys and backgrounds are very different. So it's very about values and about individual ideas, how to conduct research in general and how to conduct research in future. And whatever the case may be, I think, well, I'm very convinced that all voices are necessary and that whether it's negative or positive reactions, it might be very relevant and it helps to advance those discussions because the discussions are already ongoing. And yeah, so I think it's very important to have all those voices and concerns included as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect lead on to mine, to really think that, you know, each project and each individual has really different experiences. So mine, as Svenja's, and I have also quite different approaches to this topic, and I think that's really nice to show these two experiences. So mine really comes from being in the field. So I saw firsthand challenges of reducing the environmental impact of this of the Mosaic expedition, which was named the largest polar expedition in history. And it was absolutely huge, and there were so many people involved, and so like the science conducted was absolutely extraordinary. But it also came with so many challenges, and it was very apparent quite early on that there was no one simple solution to how, you know, being on board and how you can reduce your impact. And I think one of the main things that came from is the lack of guidelines in these areas. So it was so remote in the Central Arctic for one complete year. And it really came down to the responsibility of individual projects, which had the funds to join this expedition, to address their own environmental impact. And you know, going back to Svenja's, so the travel, you know, approach to reducing travel is essential for Svenja's project. But for Mosaic, this was actually less than 2% of the CO2 emissions produced by the expedition, as you know, you can all expect, being on an icebreaker for one entire year. But nonetheless, I think we can really all learn from each other. And this 2%, it can still be reduced. You know, it can be reduced to 1%. So it's not that saying that just because it's such a small percentage, it's negligible. I think it's still very important that we can learn from each other. But yeah, then, you know, looking at the other 98% of the emissions, but also general impact. It wasn't just CO2. So a few of us on board, mainly early career researchers, decided to get together and try and understand the impact of such a large-scale expedition, with the idea of looking forward so that we can provide this assessment, this documentation, as almost guidelines for future expeditions if they're of such a size in a similar location, for example, to use and to adapt and to learn from our experiences. So yes, as I said before, we followed the European Polar Board's guidelines for this, and also took some inspiration from the guidelines in Antarctica, but split this up into CO2 emissions, aerosols and trace gases, scientific waste, whether that was accidental loss because of, you know, ice movements, or intentional, so buoys installed on the ice that aren't meant to be picked up, the wastewater that was disposed of from the ship, onboard general waste, so just from the kitchen or from laboratories, microplastics that were produced, and then environmental interactions and noise and light. So we really dove into a lot of different aspects of the impact of this expedition. And this was all done in hindsight, so after we returned, which I think is one of the main barriers that we've come across, is trying to get this data and this information when everyone's moved on and started working on the next project. So it was quite difficult to obtain the data, and also to get people to like reflect on the experience that they had during the expedition. Because so it wasn't a top priority in the planning stage, and during the expedition, it was too late. It's too late for an early career researcher to join an expedition of such a size and say, maybe we can change X, Y, and Z. It doesn't work like this. So these impact assessments need to be done before going into the field, and yes, to learn from each other. So, I always think it's quite interesting that if this expedition of such a size was done in Antarctica, it would look completely different. There would be a lot more guidelines in place, and the role of at the institute level I think would just be more accountable. As something happens when we pass over the equator, that guidelines shift, or we lose the guidelines. But this is where I think the bottom-up pressure is needed to really move forward, and learn from past expeditions, and how it's done in Antarctica, and look again as well to the north, and see how we can change things up there. So just a quick little outlook is that we actually sent a survey to participants to gather a little bit more information on these perceived barriers to the sustainable research. And I just put the plots in the bottom right. It was quite close, apart from motivational and personal interest, which is a fantastic sign. I don't know if this is just because the people answering our survey were motivated, but that was really the lowest barrier. People want to make a difference, or people want to change how it's being conducted. The number one way that they think, or number one barrier they think is funding, technological advances, and time. So it's what we all expect. But it's opening up these discussions as to, okay, how can we change this in the future?
Great. Yeah, maybe and also looking at the time, we can keep our summary of challenges and solutions rather short. So I think one of the challenges that we encountered throughout all the projects is that there is some resistance to change, but we also came up with the solution for this one.
So this would be really to demonstrate how we can have these small successes and talk about these small wins, and show that change isn't so far away.
Yeah. Then also, money is always an issue. So what to do about funding limitations?
Which comes down to the call for funding bodies, really getting agencies involved, and we're seeing this change in the past few years. There's a lot happening, so that's a good solution.
We also have learned that all those discussions is work in progress, and so is technologies and instrumentation. So what to do about that?
So I think it's not going to change unless there's the demand. So we really need to, start pushing and start highlighting the importance of having equipment that is more sustainable.
I think we also already have demonstrated that there are ideas how to meet the challenge of lack of awareness.
So then it's webinars exactly like this one.
Exactly. And then the last challenge, there is no simple solution and the problem is too big. So we are all overwhelmed. So what to do about this?
And then, yeah, so we, break it down into smaller steps, do what you can. This bottom-up initiative isn't solving everything all at once. So, whether it's having an impact assessment for your project or an impact assessment for your expedition, there's different scales of solutions.
Right. So summing up, what does the future look like? And I think we have two big takeaways from our presentation that we would like to offer. And really the first one is that we would like to call for continuous engagement. So ongoing efforts to adapt and improve sustainable practices as new technologies and challenges emerge. And we know that this is work in progress, so we need to keep going. And it's just great to engage in ongoing discussions and webinars like this one.
And then, yeah, finally, the call to action is, talking to each individual, speaking to your project lead or your lab or your institutes, and really opening up opportunities for early career researchers either to get involved if you are a supervisor or if you're an early career researcher, really trying to find out if there are any opportunities in, that you can join these sort of discussions if it's a topic that you're interested in. The question is, if you're planning fieldwork, do you have guidelines in place? If so, is it applicable for both poles or is it just for Antarctica? And finally, can you make an impact assessment for your next fieldwork campaign? Sorry, Svenja, you go.
No, with that, I think we just wanted to mention again that the APECS RISE project group is just about to start a new term. And if you would like to get involved, you can just send out an email to the project group lead, which is Amy, or scan this QR code or access the APECS website and see all the instructions there.
So now we circle back to the question that we proposed earlier, and I'm just going to have I think we've got 10 minutes to have a look through the Q&A and see what people have been talking about. So there's something happening tomorrow, which is exploring creativity in BMX trail construction. It's extremely relevant. We can really learn from each other's practices. And we were also talking about, the learning from not just, yes, BMX trail construction, maybe there's something we can learn there if someone's involved particularly, but also if someone's involved in tourism, how can we learn from going into these environments which are, are very vulnerable. I think it's a challenge that's for absolutely everyone to think about. So yeah, thank you.
I will stop share the screen so that we can the discussion.
Yes, I saw that Denise Vural has quite a story. Would you like me to share it with the audience? And then you can comment on it.
That's great.
Okay, so Denise says, thank you for the engaging and insightful presentation. I also appreciate your questions, Svenja and Amy. Regarding your first question about how we and our institutions are working to mitigate the impact of scientific activities, I agree that this is a framework that takes time to develop especially in training individuals to adopt this approach. At my institute, discussions are ongoing. However, we currently lack a concrete plan to target specific goals. As a result, there are no clear steps outlined for each employee to follow. This brings me to the topic of individual efforts. Personally, I strive to make sustainable choices in my eating habits and modes of travel. However, when considering the scientific footprint and its feedback to the environment, I believe this is closely tied to the policies and structures of the Institute. Often there are predefined parameters we must work within. For example, I had to fly to Canada from Europe, which must be accomplished with limited timeframes and budgets. And then she says, consequently, we often have to adhere to these guidelines. I think these issues necessitate deeper discussions, not just within our institutions, but also with higher local or national scientific bodies. We need to collaboratively reframe how science can be integrated into sustainability efforts over the coming decades, especially in relation to environmental topics. I am glad you mentioned the Interact initiative on reducing CO2 emissions in Arctic science. I highly encourage everyone to explore this, as it is also highlights both carbon footprints at the institutional and individual level. I believe these discussions will not only enhance our understanding and approach to sustainable living, but will also contribute positively to our work environment and its impact on the broader ecosystem. I love that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, can you comment on that? Like, what is said, for example, about how you often have to follow the policies and structures of the institute itself, and that can make it hard to follow your individual choices in that. I don't know if you've experienced with this or.
I think sorry, Amy, go ahead.
I was gonna take a little bit, step back for this earlier when Denise was saying that, lacking a concrete plan to target specific goals. And I think unless there's a drive for institutes to actually set up these plans and set up these outlines, I don't see this happening just off their own accord. So maybe this is an example of where kind of a bottom-up initiative could happen, saying that we would love to have some guidelines that we could follow that are accessible, and it applies to a whole range of things. It takes a bit of time to get these set up, but once it's there, and then if it's done well, I think a lot of people can use them. But yeah, no, maybe Svenja want to talk about the
No, I wanted to say nearly the same thing, that I think within RISE we experience a lot of, like, we have so many different and international members. So of course everyone comes from a different institutional setting and encounters different challenges, and it's sometimes very very enriching to see and to talk about those individual experiences. And what Amy just said, that bottom-up initiatives and top-down within one institute should go hand in hand, and then it really can make an impact. So if there is bottom-up initiative that strives and pushes for more policies, but then also the institute develop policies and knows it's supported by employees, so then it goes hand in hand, and then we can really make a change.
Yes, really nice. I see a few more questions in the Q&A box, so just with time in my mind, I will just continue. Shraddha, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I'm sorry. How do you suggest conduct environmental impact assessments for tourism-related fieldwork?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So environmental impact assessments are nothing new. So they are really widely used in industry. They're widely used in Antarctica. we don't need to invent the wheel with environmental impact assessments. It's just each assessment looks very different. And to have experts on board who know the area, who know that which, where is fragile. It's really different depending on the location of I think you were talking about tourism, but yeah, also fieldwork, scientific fieldwork. So it's yeah, so I guess it's following guidelines, and I really recommend looking at the European Polar Board guidelines for the conducting an impact assessment. And yeah, it can be applied to tourism, I think.
Thank you. Yes, we will still share the links in the chat for the synthesis report and just in a moment. I'm already reading next question. Let me see. I will first go to Eloise. Is there somewhere where initiatives are shared? For instance, has someone ever been to fieldwork in the Arctic? For example, to Svalbard from continental Europe without plane? Or yeah, so do you have these kind of initiatives that are then shared on your platform, or do you know platforms like this?
Yeah,
I think I think it would be great to have such a platform, and we were thinking about it, but haven't been successful in putting it in place until now. And I think so far it was mostly sharing those examples and best practices through webinars and workshops and meetings. Yeah.
Exactly. I see Attila is holding up his hand.
Thank you, Marije. Actually, I would like to first thank APECS and especially Svenja and Amy for their cooperation and participation in the webinar series. Despite of all technical and administrational challenges, I believe their presentation on bottom-to-top initiatives will inspire many researchers, including the early career ones. And it was interesting to hear from their personal perspectives and experiences. As they underlined during the presentation, it's more challenging in the Arctic due to the different geopolitical approaches, and it may be more clear on the Antarctic side with certain regulations for all parties. However, I personally believe the top-to-bottom approach still has some deficiencies. And beside of different guidelines and policies changing from state to state in the Arctic, I guess, as Helios also stated, an online portal covering the best practices for both polar regions, maybe in a very simple way, would help individual researchers at least to ask what to ask for in their institutions or their research group for these initiatives.
Thank you.
I think that's really... I have also one more question that I was thinking of, because well, often you're working within projects like bigger horizon projects, for example, and like, how do you think that funding bodies can better support initiatives aimed at reducing environmental impact in the polar research? So should there be more of a financial incentive for those projects to show more initiative on this within their projects?
Yeah, I think it really starts there. I think that's the perfect question, because if there's no importance of planning your project with the environmental impact in mind, then it's almost lost before you've even set off. So I think the funding bodies can really, within the application, have sections saying, what steps have you taken to reduce your impact? Have you done an impact assessment? What is the CO2 emissions that you would expect from an expedition of this size, or field work of this size? And then it, it starts to get into people's minds. So it's not even changing how the funding is being distributed. I think it also comes into this dialogue just with applications. And I saw that the Swiss Poll Institute, for example, have just introduced a section on their funding proposals, and it's becoming more and more, I don't have all the examples, but it's getting a lot of traction where there's this little section in the funding application to say, have you considered the impact? And obviously, when it comes to instrument development and more, sustainable practices, then the funding is needed because it's usually a lot more expensive. Also, with Svenja's experience, traveling by train is often more expensive too. So the funding is also needed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I think. There should always be this incentive, like even if we want this to be only some kind of intrinsic motivation, it's very hard if you don't really get the space within the project to explore these new initiatives, because very often there's also not really a precedent set, like an example. So it's often a new initiative to explore. Yes, I'm looking at the time, and we are already 3 minutes past 3. So I think we can just close this for now, but only already looking at these Q&A and the questions that arise and the comments that we get, I think it's very valuable what you do with the RISE project. And I hope that the audience can find you and start being involved in your discussions as well. But yeah, for now, I want to thank you both for this presentation and your involvement and support at this webinar series. I promised that we would share some more publications on the screen. So my colleague Eva will share a slide with some publications from Interact. And yeah, I highly recommend you to go to the website from Interact and to look at their publications, because they have great outreach also when it comes to this topic. You can also scan the QR code here, or yeah, look up Interact online. We can also share the website in the chat box. And besides from really interesting publications on this topic, they also have really good publications for early career scientists on fieldwork hand guides and guidelines. So yeah, I highly recommend taking a look. And I also hope that you will stay involved with APECS, with the European Polar Board. This was the last webinar of this series, but we hope we will come back with more. And in the meantime, you can follow us, both APECS and the European Polar Board, on our socials, or sign up for the newsletter. And there will be much more in the future. So thanks again to Svenja and Amy. And thank you for all your questions in the audience, and hope to see you again.
Yeah, thank you for the engaging webinars series and for organizing it.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you again in the future. Okay, goodbye.
Bye.